Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, which highlights the July 2025 special edition of Breastfeeding Medicine. This issue focuses on the early unplanned cessation of lactation in both healthy and at-risk populations. Throughout today's session, you're encouraged to submit questions for our speakers using the questions pane in your control panel. You can send them in at any time, and we'll address them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Webinar handouts and your certificate of attendance are available in the handout section of the apps at the bottom right of your screen. If you experience any technical difficulties, please click on the help button at the bottom left of your screen. Please note that today's webinar is being recorded. After the event, you will receive a follow-up email with a link to access the recording. This special issue of Breastfeeding Medicine features work from a multidisciplinary group brought together by senior mentors, Professors Paula Meyer, Leslie Parker, Tricia Johnson, and Dr. Rebecca Hoban. We're honored to be joined today by three of these mentors. Professor Paula Meyer, Professor of Pediatrics and Nursing at Rush University Medical Center in Chicago. Dr. Meyer is a pioneering researcher and educator in human milk and lactation for premature infants with a career spanning nearly 5 decades. She spearheaded the NICU human milk research team at Rush and has published over 300 peer-reviewed manuscripts and parent education materials. Her contributions have earned her numerous honors, including the Audrey Hepburn Award and Macy Georgie Award for Lifetime Achievement in Human Milk Research. Professor Leslie Parker, professor in the College of Nursing and an adjunct professor in the College of Medicine at the University of Florida. She's had an active practice as a nurse practitioner in the neonatal intensive care unit for the last 30 years, where she cares for critically ill infants and their families. Leslie's research has been funded by the NIH and the Gerber Foundation and focuses on optimal delivery of nutrition and increasing infant consumption of mother's own milk by improving lactation success in their mothers. And Dr. Rebecca Hoban, Director of Breastfeeding Medicine at Seattle Children's Hospital and the University of Washington, is a board certified neonatologist. Dr. Hoban brings global clinical and research expertise in human milk and lactation, with a background that includes training at Harvard, Tufts, and Cincinnati Children's. Her work focuses on improving human milk provision for high-risk infants and exploring innovative approaches like milk biomarkers and stem cell therapy. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished speakers as we begin today's webinar.
Hello, everyone. My name is Paula Meyer, and I will be starting us off. As you can see, our focus is on early unplanned cessation of lactation pursuant to our July special issue. So each of us is listing disclosures so that you have this available. I'm not going to go through all of these because they are in the handouts, and in the interest of time, you can certainly see those. But primarily, we have had in our research team multiple NIH grants, foundation grants, and industry projects. So our July issue of Breastfeeding Medicine really was a brainchild that evolved with work from the senior mentors, and that would be Dr. Parker, Dr. Hoban, myself, and Dr. Johnson. So the issue itself contains an overview that was authored by Dr. Parker and myself. There's a lovely theoretical framework headed by Dr. Bookhart, a point of care integrative review, again by Dr. Bookhart, and 5 original studies. And I just want to point out, if you haven't seen the issue, the individual papers really reflect the depth and the breadth of the people that contributed. We have funding from the National Institute for Nursing Research, National Institute for Child Health and Disease, National Institute for Minority Health and Disease, and Disparities, the Family Larson Rosenquist Foundation, as well as departmental monies from Florida and from Rush University. And we had industry funding for one of our cohorts from Medela. So we really have quite a bit of sound scholarship in terms of the funding. So as I kind of go through the issue itself, I want to just show you, these are the photos of the individual investigators. For many of these people, they are young trainees, they're assistant professors, they are on K awards, they're postdoctoral students. And we were all focused on the idea that the first month postpartum is the time of greatest risk for early unplanned cessation of lactation. And this is true regardless of whether you're an otherwise healthy mother with an otherwise healthy baby, or whether you're a mother who's sick herself with a baby in the NICU. There's something about this first month. And obviously, if we can't solve the problems that occur in the first month and get mothers through that time, the idea of what is the optimal duration of breastfeeding and providing milk for babies in the NICU is really moot. So why did we focus on this first month? Well, the first thing that we see is the primary concern of mothers over this period of time is perceived or real insufficient milk volume. And we spend a lot of time in this issue highlighting the fact that there is such a thing as real insufficient milk volume, because so oftentimes it's overlooked and mothers are just told that a small amount of milk is normal, baby fussiness is normal, but instead there are issues of real insufficient milk, which we'll highlight. But I think I would also like to mention that perceived insufficient milk, as we know, can become real insufficient milk very early during this period of time with early supplementation and mothers feeling that their babies aren't getting enough milk. And then we end up with real insufficient milk. So the whole idea that there's one or the other is actually probably more of a continuum in some instances. Well, what has driven my work most recently is the idea that practitioners always recommend extra support for mothers, but without specific evidence-based intervention that tell us what that support is and what we would use to evaluate outcomes. I know as I read or I review countless articles about finding problems with milk volume in the NICU, the final discussion always talks about recommending extra support, but without the algorithms and the pathways that are going to tell us what we need to do that are specific things to be able to fix or at least to mitigate the problem. I know I myself was most concerned about the fact that interventions have been behavioral and motivational for the most part. So if mothers perceive they don't have enough milk, or in the NICU, if we see milk volume problems, we always talk about, well, the mothers need more education. We need more staff. They need more visits with the lactation care providers. We need to try peer counselors, economic incentives, skin to skin holding, all of these things that are really behavioral. But what was missing from all of this is the complex biology that takes place in this first 2 to 4 weeks postpartum that's commonly overlooked and certainly in research isn't really controlled for. So in our webinar today, we have 3 goals. I'm going to tackle the first one, which is to detail the biology of the early postpartum period within a framework that includes biologic, behavioral, and economic risk for early lactation cessation. Then Dr. Parker will take over talking about point of care measures, and Dr. Hoban will talk about maternal health complications. And all of these, again, summarize the work from our special issue. So here we go with detailing the biology. I know some of you have probably seen this slide before because I think I like to show with pictures instead of having words detail what happens with respect to lactation. But obviously during the preterm period, we see secretory differentiation or the breast becoming prepared to feed. Then we have birth with the delivery of the placenta. The delivery of the placenta causes the progesterone to plummet, as you see here, since it's the primary source of progesterone. And the progesterone falling is what unleashes prolactin to be able to synthesize milk. So this very early period of time, as we think about it, is really the hormonal control of lactation. It's a one-time event. We don't see it repeated again in lactation. So it has to be done right, or we don't get a chance to revisit it. Then what we see with the healthy baby is the baby's consuming colostrum, and the entire first day of life, on average, the full-term healthy baby consumes 15 milliliters in 10.6 feedings a day. We see secretory activation in the mother somewhere between days 2 or 3. That's milk coming in. And at this period of time, we see the taking over of the autocrine and paracrine regulation of lactation. This is the upregulation of what we would call the supply and the demand, which is really important for the milk to be thoroughly drained from the breast so that it's replenished. But it's a very complex mechanism that has to, again, take place following secretory activation to get the milk-making apparatus moving. In a healthy population, by day 4 to 7, we see mothers producing 500 to 600 milliliters. And then in the second period of the first 2 weeks, what we see is that becoming a bit more fine-tuned in terms of the mother-baby supply and demand. If we look at the same thing for neonatal intensive care, mothers who deliver prematurely and who are often sick themselves, pre-birth, and Dr. Hoban will introduce this, we see a lot of maternal health problems that can compromise not only secretory differentiation, but many of the downstream processes as well. So we see birth, again, the delivery of the placenta, which then we see the hormonal control, the progesterone falls. But our research in our special issue highlights the fact that secretory activation, when it is measured objectively with sodium and potassium measures, really demonstrates that it occurs somewhere between days 5 and 6, not between days 2 and 3. Then again, we see this autocrine and paracrine take over, where we see the supply and demand mechanisms, of which there are many involved. But what we found from our research is that even though a mother might achieve secretory activation by days 5 or 6, it takes only an minor upset in pumping over this next 14 days between whatever time she initiates secretory activation to coming to volume. Sometimes just interrupting pumping once or twice a day, we see a reversal so that the mothers then have what we would call an uptick in the sodium potassium, telling us that milk volume is compromised, that this whole autocrine paracrine mechanism is compromised so that we aren't going to see milk volume. Then coming to volume, 500 milliliters by day of life 14, and that is the strongest predictor of a baby still receiving mother's own milk at NICU discharge. So secretory activation is a one-time event that's characterized by early programming of mammary tissue. So as I said, in secretory differentiation, we see a growth in secretory cell number, we see ductal branching, all of this under the pregnancy hormones. And then once a mother gives birth, and we see the onset of secretory activation as a function of progesterone withdrawal, this is a very complex process. We see an upregulation of 4 separate transcellular pathways that synthesize and transfer mother's own milk components into the actual milk product itself. Alongside this is the closure of one paracellular pathway. This is a hormonally driven process, as I indicated, with respect that we see the fall in progesterone. However, our research has shown that it is affected by stimulation by the infant or the pump, and that more frequent use of the breast pump up to 5 times daily is a predictor of achievement of secretory activation. And that, of course, is milk coming in or lactogenesis 2. And these are the 2 papers, one again from our special issue. Well, I want to spend a minute on the sodium-potassium ratio, or the sodium and sodium-potassium ratio measures, which really measure paracellular pathway patency, because this leads into what Dr. Parker will describe as to how we use these as point of care. So the paracellular pathways are spread throughout the mammary gland, and they're just spaces between the individual cells that make milk. Functionally, what they do is allow a back and forth movement between the mother's circulation, which would be here, and the milk product, which is secreted and then drained by the pump or the baby. These products, or these components of the milk and the mother's circulation, move back and forth as a function of an osmotic gradient. So what happens when these paracellular pathways are open, as they are at birth, is that we see the maternal circulation adding sodium to the milk product itself. So sodium comes from the maternal circulation into the mammary gland. Lactose, on the other hand, is made only by the lactocytes, and it passes readily into the maternal circulation. Upon the achievement of secretory activation, the pathways are closed, and the only sodium in the milk is what is made in the mammary gland. We see this bypassing of the from the maternal circulation ended, and the lactose stays in the gland. This is what is so critical because the lactose leaving the gland itself is the trigger for mothers not being able to initiate secretory activation, because lactose is the major osmophite in the milk, and what it does is pull the liquid in so that there's an adequate milk volume. And what I want to mention when we talk about this being impermanent, the paracellular pathway closure being impermanent, is mothers in our NICU population, and actually in Dr. Kivlington's term population as well. Many of the mothers, even after they had initiated secretory activation achievement, closed these paracellular pathways with tight junctions, were reopened. And this reopening in this short period of time really tends to be one that, again, what you see isn't so much that we have salty milk, because the sodium goes in it, again, from the maternal circulation, is that the lactose is leaving. And when the lactose is escaping, then we don't see the upregulation of autocrine and paracrine control of lactation. And we see a lower milk volume because there's not the lactose there to keep the milk volume. So this is the physiology or the biology that's happening that's so often overlooked. So this is actually a diagram from Dr. Medina Polina's dissertation work that basically shows the pattern of these milk biomarkers. And what we see is from birth, secretory activation, and then mature lactation. What we see is that sodium and total protein decline, and that is a function of the paracellular pathways closing. We see lactose, citrate, and potassium increasing. And that is, again, when we talk about the lactose in early milk is very low. The paracellular pathways must close before the lactose stays in the gland. So what is this important? Well, because the paracellular pathway is what is measured when we measure sodium point of care. So sodium as a point of care measure, and I'm talking mother's own milk sodium, really allows us to detect risk. We can identify some mothers that are at risk. We can look at towards mitigating the lactation risk and management, as well as evaluation. The question, though, I think that is among all of us really to kind of pop out is who should be screened and monitored. And our special issue really proposed a framework that I think is important to understand with respect to how we look at behavioral and economic risk factors, which are very real. But the thing that we have to keep in mind is even though they're very real, they're mediated biologically. So they as well can be measured with point of care sodium. So regardless of the risk factor, and I guess I should point out, this is from our special issue. And this again was actually headed by Dr. Bookhart, and a lot of this grew out of her postdoctoral work. What we see in the center of this is our milk cup. So this is talking about mammary gland stimulation and milk removal, which is the heart of all regulation of milk volume. This is what I talk about being the biologic mediation. So the gland has to be stimulated. And if we look at the characteristics, there's frequent stimulation, effective stimulation, efficient, and comfortable. So that's stimulation and milk removal. So those are the key components, so that even though we have biologic risk factors or economic and behavioral ones, they manifest through the basic biology. So let's take a look at what this looks like. So again, what we have here, let's look at some of the basics. What's going to affect frequent, effective, efficient, and comfortable stimulation and milk removal? Well, probably the biggest culprit we all deal with is the late preterm and early term infant, because this is an infant that is not going to be able in many instances to provide the appropriate stimulation and milk removal that sets the mother up, because the milk removal is a key component of the regulation of lactation processes. So we see the other big culprit is when breast pumps are suboptimal, the supplies are suboptimal, the breast pumps aren't used the right way. But a big one here as well is we talk about frequent, is the postponing, the feeding, and the pumping. And this affects everybody. The mother in the NICU who doesn't want to leave her baby because the doctor's coming to make rounds and she sits for an extra hour. The mother who is in the postpartum unit and is expecting visitors and doesn't want to feed in public. So then when we look at the biologic ones, okay, well, what are some of the biologic things that, again, are mediated through this milk removal and stimulation? There are numerous maternal health complications that blunt the impact of the stimulation and the milk removal. And I'm going to share one example of that as we go through. As well, then, one of the first things that we were able to propose here that other people haven't looked at is the maternal costs. So when we look at the time of greatest investment in lactation in terms of a day's period of time is really during secretory activation or this early milk coming in. Out-of-pocket expenses also impact breast pump options for effective, efficient, and comfortable milk removal. Well, people say, well, what about the stress? What about the mental health? Well, the stress related downregulation of the prolactin surge and the oxytocin release are well documented. But it's not the stress itself, the brain, that's causing this. It's because they are affecting this process of the frequent, effective, and efficient milk removal because of the prolactin surge and the oxytocin release being downregulated. So it's all biological. A big culprit again, missed breastfeedings interrupt the autocrine and paracrine mechanisms, and it doesn't really matter why. As I went before, it can be because a mother doesn't have a place to pump that's private, or because she just is, as an option, just not pumping frequently. So I have one example, and then I'm going to end fairly quickly so Dr. Parker can take over. So maternal biologic risk in otherwise healthy diets is often perceived or mischaracterized as perceived and not real. So there are many maternal pre-existing health conditions and pregnancy complications, and they're outlined and the detail in the special issue with respect to the maternal metabolic disease, the inflammatory conditions, the genetic predisposition. All of these mechanisms are beautifully detailed. But if we take an example here of overweight and obesity, if we look at how many interventions have targeted overweight and obesity and have focused on body image and have focused on peer counseling to no avail, well, if we look simply at the biology that is not being investigated, controlled for, or addressed in any way, 65% of the childbearing population is either overweight or obese. We know that metabolic and inflammatory mechanisms that are a consequence of obesity affect secretory differentiation, secretory activation, and upregulation of autocrine and paracrine pathways. We see a potential for diabetes and hypertensive disorders of pregnancy. Obesity increases the likelihood of operative delivery and other therapeutics that in turn impact these processes, and involves multiple mechanisms at different lactation stages. So again, there's an interruption of metabolic signaling pathways, upregulation of inflammatory processes, altered endocrine regulation of mammary gland development performance, and I could go on. So to have an intervention with a population with maternal biologic risk and not have something built in biologically is to not be able to address the problem, or at least have an underlying mechanism that is not being controlled for. And finally, the thing I want to leave us all with is that in the special issue, we decided to not have a special paper on social determinants of health, but rather embed these within each of the papers. So I would just try it out here. So how many papers or studies do we have focused on minority populations or on Black women especially, when we see that metabolic disease and other chronic health conditions are disproportionately burdensome for this population? There are high unpaid work responsibilities that may preclude frequent feeding or pumping, lack of access to quality breast pumps and equipment, And then when we get into the behavioral, a lack of a private place to feed or pump. Many times in the multi-generational households, I've had mothers say to me that they don't want to use a breast pump because they have to do it or breastfeed in front of the sister's boyfriend or someone else, so that privacy impacts the frequency. The traditional role of the Black grandmother, lack of community structures that assist new dyads, and also we know that there's all this lack of engagement when hurried prenatal and hospital staff just assume this population isn't going to be successful or doesn't want to breastfeed. So within our model, we have a lot of implications, but I think especially for interventions that are focused on social determinants of health to include the biology. So with this, I have the summary. I'm not going to take time to read it to you because I want Dr. Parker to be able to take over with her presentation about point of care measures that allow us um, uh, to identify, mitigate, treat, and evaluate. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Meyer, and I will go ahead and share my screen. Okay. And Jess, you might need to help me because I don't see it coming back on my other one. Oh dear.
Nope, you're doing good. You just need to click on your presentation at the bottom there.
Okay, my presentation at the bottom. It does not want to work. Let's see. It is.
Would you like me to just share?
I would think that would be good, but I would love, this worked so well last time when we did it, but let's see if I can do it this way. Hold on just a second. I'm sorry, guys. There, how about that? Is that working?
Excellent. We see it perfectly.
Wonderful. So thank you, Dr. Meyer. I'm sorry, I get a D- in technology. I actually had it written down and I forgot one of the steps. So what I wanted to do is move through what Dr. Meyer said, and I wanted to really specifically focus on evidence-based point of care technologies that can be used to mitigate and manage lactation risk during that first critical month postpartum. And what I want to focus on is two different things. I want to focus on not only monitoring of sodium and potassium concentrations, but I'm also going to focus on test weighing procedures that we can do in both our healthy dyads as well as our mothers of infants in the intensive care unit. So I'm going to go ahead and start off with monitoring of sodium and potassium concentrations. And I'm going to look a little bit about what Dr. Meyer looked at, and I'm just going to briefly go through the physiology again. So again, these are the epithelial cells, these yellow rectangles, and you can see there's open tight junctions here and closed tight junctions over here. And as Dr. Meyer said, when these tight junctions are open, then we can have free sodium that goes from the maternal circulation into the milk. And why I think that this is so important and what makes me think about why should these paracellular pathways be open, because I think about what is supposed to happen during that early postpartum time. So that time between the time that the birth occurs and the mom reaches secretory activation, we think about what does the baby need during that time? Well, the baby needs basically his first immunization. So if I think about those paracellular pathways being open, very large molecules such as immunoglobulins and other large bioactives can easily go across that juncture and go into the milk and be ingested by the baby. And then when secretory activation occurs, those tight junctions close, and therefore now, as Dr. Meyer was saying, we can have less sodium going into the breast milk, and we have more nutrition, more milk supply, so that the baby has received the immunoglobulins in that first immunization, And now what the baby needs to have is increased nutrition to be able to feed and to be able to grow. And so when we look at sodium and we look at monitoring it and we think about how we can use it in our research and in our practice, it's actually very easy. You can use a handheld sodium monitor, which is this right here. Very much, in my opinion, looks like a pregnancy test. And it was actually first used to be able to look at pool chemicals to see if you needed to add more salt or other minerals to your pool. It has been validated to use in mother's own milk to look for both sodium and potassium. And as you can see, you can put a tiny drop of milk onto that sensor, and all it takes is about 0.2 cc's. And so we're not talking about so much milk that we're taking it away from infant consumption or even away from infant oral immunotherapy, just a tiny bit of milk. And after a few seconds, you will be able to get the sodium or the potassium volume here, or the value here. And so if we have high sodium levels, it means that those tight junctions are open. And if you have a low sodium level, it means those tight junctions are closed. And the threshold that we use for high and low can either be, some people use 16 millimoles and some people use 20 millimoles. And so we had a couple of very interesting articles, one that has been submitted for publication and one that was actually published in our special issue that made it a little bit easier, I think, for us to use in both research and practice. And these were done with some of our colleagues, Dr. Shinlin Pei and Dr. Marion Ben-Dixon. And the first one is looking at whether we can use just sodium or do we need to use a sodium and potassium ratio. And the reason that some people think that we need a sodium and potassium ratio, because it really calculates, it really takes into account the natural variation in the aqueous or lipid content of the mother's own milk. And so if you do that, it makes things a little bit more complicated, because although that monitor shows you a potassium and it shows you a sodium concentration, it doesn't calculate a ratio. So the practitioner or the researcher actually has to go back and do that. And not only is that difficult, it also increases the risk of error. And what Dr. Pei realized and what she reported on is that these are very, very closely correlated. So sodium and a sodium and potassium ratio are so closely correlated that you only really need the sodium. And so we don't have to go through all of that work in calculating those ratios. And what Marion Ben-Dixon showed us is that some people have said, well, you know, as milk changes throughout the day, perhaps we need to monitor it every more than once a day. We need to look at sodiums twice a day, which again, if we're clinicians using it in an office or in a hospital or in the community, makes it even more difficult, makes it more time consuming. And what she and her team were able to report is that you only need to do it once a day. Now, it's important that you do it at the same time of day, but only one time a day is sufficient to be able to provide enough information for both research and practice. And one of the things, and Dr. Meyer had talked about this somewhat, is that tight junction closure is not always permanent. And for me, this was groundbreaking. I always thought, and I think most of us always thought, is that once you reach secretory activation and that sodium went down, you're done. Secretory activation was permanent. You never went out of secretory activation until the mother went on to wean her infant. But we have found both in the preterm infant through the work of Dr. Hoban, as well as in where there's some suggestions in mothers of term infants, that they do open and they do close. And as Dr. Meyer was saying, this can be related to milk removal frequency, and it can also be related to inflammation within the breast. So it can diagnose both mastitis, and it can be used to look at preclinical mastitis as well. So when you have that inflammation associated with mastitis, those tight junctions will open and the sodium level in the milk will go up. Now, in that special issue, we also had work by Katie Kivlagan, very exciting work. And she actually showed that not only in the preterm infant does this impermanence occur, but it also occurs in term infants. And so she was able to look at 11 full-time mother-infant dyads, and she followed them for 14 days in the community. And what she found was that 18% of them, so it was only 2 moms, but it was 18% in this figure here, actually reached secretory activation. And she used a threshold of 12. And they reached secretory activation, but within those first 10 days, they actually moved out of secretory activation, and those tight junctions opened back up. And so again, this may be very, very important as we're looking at our mother-infant dyads, and that secretory activation is not permanent. What Katie also showed is that mothers were able to collect sodium samples within their home. So they were able to collect the samples and be able to provide them to researchers. So it was feasible for these mothers in their home to collect the milk samples. And there was also a suggestion that this was a very important monitoring for healthcare providers in the community area. So what she found was those mothers that had a later onset of secretory activation had infants with greater weight loss at week 1. And so what does that tell us? What does that tell us perhaps that we should be doing clinically? And I think it really suggests is maybe mothers should be monitored during that first week with sodium levels. And if we start seeing mothers that have a delayed or a later onset of secretory activation, perhaps we should intervene earlier with perhaps some increased support, perhaps some interventions, or perhaps we could consider, does that baby, especially if it's a baby that's high risk, like a late preterm infant or an early term infant, does that baby need some supplementation or greater monitoring for their weight loss? And what I see happening is that in the community with these mother-infant dyads, it has some really significant clinical implications. And so what could clinicians use it for? I think one of the most important things we could use it for is identifying real versus perceived insufficient milk supply. And so we could help mothers figure out, well, is your baby crying at day 4 because you just have a baby that's crying, which is normal? Or is that baby crying because you have not reached secretory activation yet? And perhaps that mother is at 6 days, hasn't reached secretory activation. Should we be intervening with that infant and possibly giving something like supplementation? We could also consider it for monitoring our high-risk mothers. So perhaps our mothers with diabetes, our mothers with high BMI and obesity, could they be monitored more closely to look at when does that secretory activation occur? And determining the need for intervention. Do some of these babies need supplementation? And I think as a group that's really, giving high doses of mother's own milk and exclusively breastfeeding is critically important and very important to me. But some babies are going to need supplementation. And perhaps we can actually decrease the amount of supplementation that we provide if we have objective measures to see what babies actually need them. So a good example of this is if I took my baby, or a mother takes her baby to a healthcare provider, and that healthcare provider checks a sodium level at 5 days, and the sodium is very high at 60, then perhaps we can look at that baby and say, you know what, milk hasn't come in at day 5 or 6. I think this baby is someone that may need supplementation or at least need frequent weight checks. We can also look and see if our interventions were successful. And as we talked about, prevention of excessive weight loss and complication, and perhaps even diagnosis of mastitis or preclinical mastitis. And I could see healthcare providers, IBCLCs, and even doulas doing this in the community. Bookhart actually was doing some work in doulas where she had the doulas go into the community with their clients, check sodium levels, and be able to provide some interventions to that mother-infant dyad. So now I really want to go into test weighting, a strategy to reduce early unintended lactation cessation. And so I think most of us know what test weighing is, so I'm going to briefly go through that. So when we do a test weighing, we do a pre-feed weight. So before the infant breastfeeds, we weigh the baby on a special scale. The mother then breastfeeds, and immediately following the breastfeeding, we re-weigh that infant. And that post-feed weight should have the same diaper, the same clothes, the same blankets, everything that the baby was weighing during the pre-feed weight. Now, what I see and what I hear, and I think it probably is one of the banes of my existence, is I hear nurses, lactation consultants, and other healthcare providers saying, we don't need it. We got this. It doesn't work anyway. And when I read some of the literature surrounding lactation care, I sometimes see, well, test weighing is a very controversial technique. And I would have to argue with pretty much all of these statements. So if I think about the statement of we don't need it, we got this, well, I don't think we do have it. There's good evidence that those clinical indices that we as nurses and lactation care providers look at, for instance, there's milk in the mouth, there's audible swallowing, even good tools such as the latch tool are not accurate. So the latch tool may show that I have a good latch, but it doesn't look at milk transfer from the breast to the infant. Test weighing is accurate. So when we think about it doesn't work anyway, why should we use it? It is accurate. And over and over and over again, research has shown that it's accurate. And it's accurate and reliable when performed by nurses and mothers. And I actually, in my unit, I got so frustrated with this whole argument that I said, fine, we're in our unit. We're going to prove this, because my nurses would say, well, it works in other places or in research, but we can't use it. So we had 3 nurses worked in my unit take 50 babies that were tube fed. So like the baby right here. And we actually we pre-weighed them. We gave them a tube feeding, so we knew exactly how much feeding that baby received. And we did a post weight. And we found that within 5 milliliters, all 50 babies had an accurate weight. So it was plus or minus 5 mils. So it's not 100% accurate, but it is accurate enough to use in clinical practice. So how can we use it in clinical practice? And so Laurel Bookhart, in a wonderful integrative review that was published in our special edition, did quite a nice analysis of some of the ways that we can use it. Monitoring mothers at risk, perceived lactation problems. And so Kent et al. Found that perceived lactation problems, if mothers perceived that they were having these problems, the baby was actually consuming less milk. Transfer at 3 days postpartum equaled or predicted whether or not mothers could exclusively breastfeed at 3 months. So test weights could be used for identifying mothers at risk for non-exclusive breastfeeding. They looked at the effect of tongue-tie repair, whether or not there was increased milk transfer, correlation with latch scores, so we can use it for assessment of some of our lactation tools, or were the effects of natural galactagogues? Were infants consuming more milk after their mothers received galactagogues? So can we look at the effect of some of the interventions that we provide mothers? And again, looking at real versus insufficient milk supply is a really critical way that we can use these. Assess the need for supplementation. And this is easily performed by not only healthcare providers, but also by mothers in the hospital or in their home. And we do know through research that the use of test weights does not increase stress. It actually reduces stress because moms feel like their babies are getting a sufficient volume of their milk. And in the NICU, it's also important. So I had a mom, I remember mom, this was last week. She and the nurse were talking and she goes, you know what? I'm breastfeeding my baby, but we're giving him a full OG feed after I breastfeed. But he's breastfeeding really well. I can see him, he's swallowing, my breast is softer. Do I need to give him the full NG feed? And I'm like, well, let's find out. And we pulled out the scale, showed her how to use it. And yeah, the baby was transferring about half of his feed. So we reduced his OG feed by about 50%. And so determining the need for supplementation. Discharge planning, I think test weights are critical because not all of our babies are going to be able to go home exclusively breastfeeding. Some babies are going to be very vulnerable, babies that go home on oxygen, that have severe bronchopulmonary dysplasia, or need additional calories through fortification may not be able to be exclusively breastfed. And looking at test weights for the first maybe 3 days prior to discharge can lay out a plan so that the mom can be successful. And again, post-discharge, how can we move that baby objectively to an exclusive breastfeeding baby as time goes by? So I think we really need to think about that lactation can be a challenging journey, and how can we support our lactating mothers? In the United States, our mothers have so many comorbidities. They have high BMI and obesity, high levels of hypertension, diabetes, high rates of C-section. Preterm moms have immature mammary development, maternal stress, a lot of maternal infant separation. And so we can use some of these very objective tools to really help support our mothers and help them to reach their lactation goals. So with that, I would like to go into Dr. Hoban, and she will start work with characterizing maternal health complications that impact the achievement of secretory activation and a threshold mother's own milk volume. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Parker. All right. Hopefully I can figure out this sharing thing. All right. All right. Did that work? Hopefully. Are we good? Okay. All right. Can everyone hear me?
You sound wonderful, Dr. Hoban.
Okay, perfect. There was just empty silence. Okay, awesome. Okay, thanks everyone. And I will try to hopefully have a couple minutes for questions. I'll try to get through my slides pretty quickly, but thank you for having me. Here are my disclosures. And yes, I'm going to talk about maternal health complications. So as my colleagues have already alluded to, we have this lovely review article in the special edition, and one of their focuses is on the inflammatory conditions and metabolic health challenges that we see so frequently in our moms, both those who deliver term and preterm. And a lot of our moms have a lot of these risk factors, and unfortunately they tend to go together. And so we really wanted to study the effect, both direct and indirect, of all these different comorbidities. For example, cesarean delivery associated with lots of other things like hypertensive disorders of pregnancy and obesity, and it probably results in a lot of indirect effects. These moms often have delayed pumping or breastfeeding just because of the logistics. Baby often is whisked away from mom. Mom has had opiates or sedation or even general anesthesia, and she's in pain. But there's also likely direct effects of the actual surgery. So both the surgery, the anesthesia that's required, the stress, all of these different elements affect both the oxytocin and prolactin surges and responses that are so crucial for early lactation. Overweight and obesity is becoming incredibly common throughout the world. And again, we often see other risk factors with it. These moms might have actually different lactation plans because of negative body image or confidence. They don't want to expose their breasts for breastfeeding or for pumping. And they might have difficulty actually positioning with pumping or with the baby. But physiologically, there are definite challenges intrinsic as well. So high BMI, for example, we see these moms have higher both serum and milk leptin. Now, what does that mean? Well, it's been shown that these actually relate to serum prolactin, and we know that prolactin is critical for closing those tight junctions to achieve secretory activation, and it also makes more milk-making cells. And so when moms are obese, they have the reduced ability to respond to this. They have prolactin resistance. And they've also shown in animal models that this actually makes pups feed less. And so then you get this vicious decreased supply and demand cycle. Milk leptin actually directly inactivates transcription factors, so it actively makes you make less milk. In addition, people have shown that the actual response to suckling, so either a pump or a baby, you get less bang for your buck if you're obese. So you get less of a prolactin response. And even though these moms may appear to have large breasts, they often have actually reduced glandular tissue and a lot of adipose tissue, but this isn't recognized because their breasts don't look small. Diabetes often goes along with obesity, so you have this really complex inflammatory metabolic milieu. And we have seen indeed that this results, for instance, in increased milk insulin, and therefore is associated with less exclusivity of mother's milk. Now, if you think about it, insulin is really important with lactation, but if you have insulin resistance, which we see with type 2 diabetes, how can that affect things? Because insulin is essential for both secretory differentiation, so building that milk-making mechanics during pregnancy, but also for secretory activation and milk production. You have insulin-sensitive genes that are upregulated, and you need insulin itself to actually make milk. And so if you have insulin resistance, you're probably going to have intrinsic challenges. Finally, hypertensive disorders of pregnancy, so preeclampsia or chronic hypertension, again, is associated with all the other things I already talked about. These moms are often edematous, so they have difficulty with the baby latching or with using a pump. But I think most importantly is they feel terrible when they're on magnesium, which is used to treat preeclampsia. They're sleepy, they feel sick, and they aren't easily able to actually pump. It's also possible that magnesium itself has direct effects on lactation. And finally, the actual hypertension might have differences. We think there's differences with placentation and with the actual circulation that also might affect actual lactation. And this was alluded to again in this Bookhart article that suggests that inflammation in general really directly affects secretory differentiation and all of those earliest steps in lactation. So I really wanted to further answer this question. And so this is one of the other papers in the special edition where we really focused on maternal complications and what that actually ended up meaning for pump-dependent moms. Again, we used our sodium meter, almost 150 moms of preterm babies. And this is the largest detailed biomarker-based sodium secretory activation analysis that we are aware of. This was a high-risk population, so a lot of hypertensive moms. The vast majority were overweight or obese, and the majority had a cesarean section. So these were moms who were set up potentially to have challenges. So fortunately, the vast majority actually achieved secretory activation, but it took them about twice as long as your healthy term mom, so 6.5 days versus 3. But of those who achieved secretory activation, less than half continuously maintained it. So Dr. Parker and Dr. Meyer had already alluded to this reopening of tight junctions. And indeed, we saw this. But of these outcomes, so achieving secretory activation, when it happened, and did you maintain it, the strongest predictor for all of these outcomes separately was the number of daily pumping sessions. We also looked at mother's milk volume. So a little bit less than half achieved that critical coming to volume. So 500 mLs a day, which we've previously shown is the strongest predictor of continued lactation through to NICU discharge. We saw the mean pumped volume over these 2 weeks was about 300 mLs a day, but with a really wide range. And just like the previous slide, for both of these outcomes, by far the strongest predictor was daily pump counts. So let's drill down briefly into the actual different maternal risk factors. And quickly then, alluding to this pumping. So we talked about how pumping is really, really critical for all of these outcomes. And this was actually, we actually delved down into this a little bit more in this separate paper in the special issue that I want to just spend one slide on because it has, I think, our super cool data points. So in this paper, we looked at pumping. So we looked at the first 5 days of pumping. and how that predicted outcomes at day 7. We found that every additional hour spent pumping in the first 5 days, and you might say, well, an hour of pumping, that's a lot. It's actually only 3 to 4 pumping sessions over those 5 days, so less than 1 extra pump a day. This resulted in over a liter of additional milk by day 7 and almost 3 times the odds of achieving secretary activation. So this is a massive, I think, really exciting data point to share with families, especially when they're really challenged to pump frequently. 1 more pump session a day. In the literature, you should get more than a liter more of milk in the first week, which is an incredible amount of milk for a small baby. So going back to our maternal complications article, so we then drill down into hypertensive disorders of pregnancy, diabetes, and obesity to really see what are the direct and indirect effects of these challenges. So moms that had preeclampsia, this was the only diagnosis in which they were actually less likely to achieve secretory activation. But interestingly, this was also the only diagnosis in which moms pumped less. And we did some complicated analysis, and we showed that it was actually not only the preeclampsia, but also the less pumping that resulted in this issue, probably due to moms having magnesium exposure and not actually pumping. But this is modifiable. Interestingly enough, this was temporary. So although it took longer to achieve secretory activation and they were less likely to, and they pumped less frequently, they got there in the end. So their daily pumped volumes were actually similar to other moms, and they were just as likely to achieve coming to volume. So this is a time-limited condition that if we support them with extra pumping, they can catch up later. So I think this is a really important clinical opportunity. Conversely, moms who are overweight or obese or diabetes, they pumped at the same frequency as healthy moms, but they actually had worse outcomes. So even if they pumped the same amount, they got less bang for their buck. So they were less likely to achieve secretory activation. It took them longer. With diabetic moms, they were less likely to come to volume. So suggesting those intrinsic challenges that we see that probably have a physiologic or biologic basis. Moms who are overweight or obese had lower milk volumes. Again, suggesting that there's direct effects. I'm going to try to speed up because I know we have 3 minutes left. So overall, in this high-risk cohort, moms took twice as long to achieve secretory activation, but they did. Less than half achieved coming to volume, but pumping was the main predictor of everything. These moms only pumped 4 to 5 times a day, despite what we suggest about 8 times. The number of morbidities, so having multiple ones, were not predictive, nor was cesarean section. So our main recommendation is pump, pump, pump. Pump frequently and pump early. So early lactation success in vulnerable pump-dependent moms relies on a lot of factors. And these maternal and inflammatory diagnoses like obesity, they directly affect lactation. We really need more research. We need to study chorea, which we didn't, and include more moms with diabetes because we actually didn't have that many, surprisingly. We need clinical interventions that can consider how we can improve early pumping frequency, especially those moms with preeclampsia who we showed pumped less, but who could experience catch-up milk volume later if we help them pump. Remembering that 1 more hour of pumping in the first 5 days gets you another liter of milk, which is huge. And finally, mothers with overweight or obesity or diabetes appear to have intrinsic physiologic challenges, and they are less responsive to pumping frequency. But we need to see if we do help them pump more, because again, these moms only pumped 4 to 5 times a day on average. Can we kind of get over that hump and actually help them get more milk? Is individualized support with daily sodium the answer? I think we need more data. And this is also useful to set realistic expectations, especially if they have a lot of risk factors, to say, you know what, you are doing everything you can, every amount is good, and then we are so happy that you are still pumping. I think the question also remains, can we actually generalize this to healthy term dyads, especially moms who are overweight or obese? And I think we don't yet know the answer to that. So thank you for all of your attention. I know we're right at the top of the hour, and so we don't have tons of time for questions, but thank you, and I'm happy to be here. Jess, if you can whisk me away.
Yes, I will definitely. And thank you so much, all of you. This has been such an engaging session today. So we do have time for a couple of questions. There's been several that have come through. One consistent question people are asking about if they test mom's milk on day 10 and find high sodium levels, is adding effective stimulation and drainage the next thing to do to reverse it? So maybe talk a little bit about this, but could you provide some
So
more guidance?
I could perhaps answer that. It could be one way to do it, but I think the nice thing about checking the sodium is that perhaps that's your first line of defense or whatever. So maybe you have a mom that is pumping or breastfeeding 4 times a day, and you say, please go up to 6 times a day or 7 times a day or whatever it is, power pump. The beauty with the sodium levels is then you can check it the next day to see, did it make an impact? Instead of just guessing and seeing, well, it looks like we think it made an impact, we can actually see the sodium level go down, and you can see, was that intervention effective?
Excellent, thank you. So there's also some questions in the chat asking about power pumping versus pumping every 3 to 4 hours around the clock. Is that something you can address from the research you've done? Any?
I think we still don't know the answer to that, particularly in the pump dependent population. And we are actually trying to answer that question in a way. Hopefully the NIH agrees that this is an important question when we submit in January. But for that plant, I hope the NIH is listening. Probably not. But we are trying to figure out the importance of pumping around the clock, whether long pumping sessions during the day is better than allowing moms to have sleep at night. We don't know. Stay tuned. Maybe next year.
So Jess, I'm sorry, I was muted.
That's okay. Sorry.
Yeah,
Yep.
so I think that when we put together everything into the pumping pathways, if we look at the pumping frequencies in that early period of time that are the minimum number that mothers need to be able to achieve coming to volume, it's 5. And and whether or not that needs to be a nighttime pumping, I think has to be rethought too, in light of Rebecca's work that shows how sick the mothers are. Because when you wake a mother who's already sick, you blunt the prolactin response. So, but I think that minimum, getting to a minimum of 5 times a day and more if the mother can, is what all of our data are showing that are predicting mothers coming to volume.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. There's been a lot of active chat today, so I appreciate everyone taking some time to engage with the chat with us. Someone else is asking, we'll use as our final question today, about how quickly do the junctures really close?
So
Well,
we see one. Sorry, go ahead, Paula.
Well, I think that there's obviously we see there's variability, and and I think that's the other thing in our newer papers since the issue. I think we're going to see a trend that's going to be mothers that are starting at a 50 coming to a 40 coming to so that the 20 may very well be a gateway into something smaller. But it's dependent on many things. We have shown that the feeding and the pumping from our data speed that up. So I think that that's an important thing, but and it's not all one size right. You think there's one pathway, but it's throughout the breast. So it's not going to happen even necessarily in the same breast. I mean, in the 2 breasts at the same time. So, but again, secretory activation day 2 to 3 in healthy populations and days 5 to 6 in our moms that are with preterms, as Rebecca just showed.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And really want to thank you, Paula, Leslie, and Rebecca, and everybody for joining our webinar today. We looked at the secrets of secretory activation, where we highlighted the July 2025 special edition of breastfeeding medicine. So once we leave today's webinar, you will be redirected to a survey about the webinar. We really appreciate you taking the time to complete it and value your feedback. You're also going to receive an email with a link to view today's webinar recording, and it will also have a link to view the special edition of Breastfeeding Medicine, which is open access, and you'll be able to read all of these articles that have been discussed. So on behalf of Medila's Medical Affairs team and our speakers, thank you again for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.